What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Conspiracy or Just a Coincidence. I am Jack Allen. First, go follow me at Jack Podcast, and that's it. Yeah, I don't have anything else to plug, but I'm super excited. I've been trying to get this show, and it's my fault with Conrad here on the show. But so I'm really excited to have him on. We're going to talk a few things, but Russia, Ukraine. So first, Conrad, thanks for being on the show, dude. First, tell everybody your pod, all that kind of stuff. And we'll start with that.
Thanks, Jack. I want to say, it has been a while, and I want to give Jack credit because he was one of the first people that reached out to me to have me on his show when I started my show. And now it seems like he's jumping on the bandwagon. No. This has been, in the works. So thank you again for that, Jack. You've got some great episodes on your channel. Thanks. But I'm Conrad Franz. I am the main host of World War Now. I do with a buddy of mine, Dmitry Kaligan, who's a Russian feller. And we have a Substack, worldwarnow.substack.com, a Twitter, YouTube, World War Now. And we discuss, I guess, our angle is what I consider the ongoing Third World War from the perspective of Orthodox Christianity, rising multipolarity, and I guess what I consider the return of civilization into our kind of demystified, secularized world. But yeah, I know all about politics. I write for Dr. Steve Turley, and so I'm in the I'm in the game as far as pontificating on what's going on in the world. So thanks for having me.
I've heard that name, Steve Turley. What's his role?
He's a big political guy, big Trump guy. He has a big YouTube channel, over 1 million subs, and I write for his website and help with all sorts of things, kind of behind the scenes.
How old are you?
I'm 25, just turned 25.
Damn, dude, you're killing it. That's
Thanks,
great.
Man.
What got you? You've always been interested in politics, or?
Yeah, I mean, I was born in Arlington, Virginia. My parents, they met in the world of politics, and I grew up in the Caribbean actually because my dad, after a few years of that, was like, this whole DC thing is, like, for lack of a better word, satanic, and so I grew up in the Caribbean for a few years. Moved back to the States. But yeah, I've always been, very conservative Christian. And, a little over 3 years ago now, I converted to Orthodox Christianity from Protestantism. So that's been, obviously my political opinions developed, and then kind of becoming a more traditionally minded person that fared into it. But even before I was Orthodox, I obviously held very traditional Christian political perspectives. But then becoming Orthodox, that, there's all the theological, personal, faith journey behind that. But then that helped me, I guess, really kind of take what I had learned before, just being a political person, and then develop what I consider now a fully developed worldview, or like a Weltanschauung, that helps, answer all the questions of, metaphysics, ethics, and that, and even what I would consider geopolitics. I think the current geopolitical realignment can only be understood in that holistic kind of way.
And did your because I was raised Presbyterian. My grandparents, they were Russian Orthodox, but did your parents did they convert with you, or just you?
Not yet. We'll see. You said they're Presbyterians, so
well, we look kind of similar, Conrad. So that's why I was asking.
Yeah, are we some good Scottish fellas? Is that what we're?
Yeah, dude, I'm a Scottish guy. Yeah, dude. Yeah, you look like, I was like, I'm kind of looking. You were looking a little similar here. So
yeah, we got the good Celtic American physiognomy. It's good times here.
Oh, that's so funny, dude. Well, first of all, I just saw before we started that Barack Obama's chef, I think it said he drowned very near the property in there, which I think the Cape Cod one, I think, or whichever, somewhere up there. But I just wanted any, is it a conspiracy or just a coincidence that he drowns moments, very short distance away from an $8 million or whatever it is dollar compound that Barack
$12 million Martha's Vineyard mansion, and the personal chef. I mean, look, I get that, like, if you're a president, you can make money in a lot of ways. You're obviously probably, no matter how not corrupt you supposedly are, you're going to probably boost your net worth, unless you're Trump. But Obama with the $12 million Martha's Vineyard mansion, the personal chef, they really aren't trying to be subtle at all with the, like, we've just gotten extravagantly wealthy off of our political activist career. And I mean, I've seen a lot of the good guys on Twitter saying this is like an Ed Buck situation. This is like, one of these kind of, was there some kind of degenerate drug party going on and someone ended up dead out back doing something suspicious? Is this someone who saw? I mean, look, he's a personal chef, right? I just actually, in one of our most recent episode of World War Now, me and my co-host opined on some of the reasons why Yevgeny Prigozhin in Russia may not have been taken out, because he was such a high level person, supposedly was Putin's personal chef. So
Right.
he,
Yeah.
who knows what he's seen? They can't, who knows how, if he has dead man switch about information of elites, as Dimitri said, who did what line of coke where, and, a little worse, who did something to this child where, who knows what's going on, Epstein style stuff. But yeah, it seems like it could easily be one of those situations. Like, and I'm not trying to just come in here and do the red blue dialectic, but like, if it was almost anybody else besides Obama, everyone would be like, what the hell? Like, okay, let's at least get all the facts. But people are already just saying like, who cares? People die on paddle boards all the time. Like,
well, I read and I don't know like how conspiracy, but I read a long time ago. It's called like the Manchurian Candidate, and it's about Barack Obama, just how he was created. Oh, dude, look at us, bro.
yeah,
My God,
Stanley Rowe.
We look similar. We got the same drink, but yeah, and it was, I forget who it's by, but they just went over his backstory of like grandfather, or CIA.
Yeah.
His mom's married to people in 3 countries that happen to have revolutions. 2 years after she gets there, she's an anthropologist. There's so much evidence how anthropology was used by the CIA just to learn about what they could use to manipulate and coerce the public.
Yeah, he's married to a transsexual. I mean,
Dude, absolutely. Yeah. And I know that's like the boomer thing, but it is real. Like my wife's pregnant. You have not a single photo of your, like, that's impossible, dude. She takes photo, all the time.
We've all seen the back. Okay. I wish my back looked like that. Okay. Like we've all seen it.
Oh, dude, that's hilarious. Well, so yeah, we'll start with the Russia Ukraine, and then I also want to even get to I like talking about you would be a better defender of Monarchy, so maybe we'll finish with that. But I guess so. Obviously, I've had a few of my friends on, and no one's on the Ukraine side. Most of the people that I have on, they'll take the stance that this Russia Ukraine war is just another distraction. It's not a real, these people are all in the same groups. It's just to continue the military industrial complex. But what's your take on, is this a legitimate battle? Whatever. What is your idea of what's going on here?
Yeah, to kind of address the people that are, I think assessing that, thousands of young Christians dying on both sides of this is a tragedy. That being said, and I even agree with, if people want to learn more, I do cover the more kind of, there's certain words we're not going to say on YouTube, and I cover a lot of that behind my paywall. And we do talk about how both elites on both sides let's say they hold dual citizenship from the same country. A lot of them do. And those both sides, I do believe, are orchestrating this conflict into, at this moment, what I actually believe to be kind of a stalemate, or something where at least like just pumping Ukraine to the point where they can keep just fighting enough and they're still dying. I mean, there's the idea that there's even been articles that there's certain people want to turn Ukraine into like a new Israel, for
yes, I've seen those
people and stuff. That being said, my actual take on how this is unfolding in regards to that, and this ties into something I talked about on my last show, which is the arrest of Igor Girkin, or Igor Strelkov, who a lot of people may know is a really famous commentator, former FSB agent in Russia, who actually led soldiers into the Donbass in 2014 to fight against like the Azov, like the neo-Nazi, like the Banderite, like militias, right when this started. He basically is the reason why the resistance was able to continue from 2014 up until the Russians actually intervened in 2022.
No,
and he was just arrested in Russia for basically being too critical of the war from like the right. Like he thinks that the elites are hamstringing the armed forces and the people that could do it, and that we need he's on it for a full monarchist revival in Russia, and that we can have total victory in Ukraine. Awesome. But the problem is, the people in power in the Kremlin, not all of them want that. They are just trying to keep a level playing field. For better or for worse, Vladimir Putin in many ways is still playing games with the West. Like he still somehow thinks that like we can revive like the 2014 even like relationship that Russia had with America and with Britain and everything. And I think that's very silly. If I'm being honest, I think the best situation ultimately for people on the ground, saving people's lives, and for me at least, from an Orthodox Christian perspective, to help resolve the schism ongoing inside Ukraine between the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the State Department backed quote unquote Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which is not legitimate in the eyes of most of world Orthodoxy. I believe the best solution is total Russian victory, for lack of a better word, like basically maximum territorial gains, not necessarily into Western Ukraine, but basically everything east of the Dnieper River. There's the angst and the ethnic tension that has been stoked by this like rampant and manufactured Ukrainian nationalism by the West. It's not something that can ever be like resolved by some, like people say Minsk 3, which is Minsk 2 was the first kind of ceasefire during when the civil war was going on before Russia invaded, and that's what collapsed in 2022 and everything.
Okay.
And Minsk 3, like another agreement like that, is not going to cut it. Like the current regime in Ukraine versus with its backers in the West, it's completely antithetical to any idea of like a Russian civilization, and that's a big thing. Like my boss, Dr. Steve, talks about this a lot, how like Russian civilization is reemerging after, 80 years of communism, right? Like Russia didn't experience this Westernization, secularization from like the French Revolution, the American Revolution into today. They went from absolute monarchy with a brief period of 12 years of a constitution, still absolute constitutional monarchy, and then right into Bolshevism, like straight communism.
Right.
And now we're back to, frankly, no one knows what it is. It's an attempt to appear like a Western democracy, but Putin's been in power for 20 plus years. He keeps extending his rule. It's basically it's a sort of regentship in everything but name. He's kind of like, imagine like Lord of the Rings. He's like the regent of Gondor and of Minas Tirith, but it doesn't call himself that. He still calls himself the president. They still have voting and everything. And that does come with some drawbacks still. It's not like there aren't checks and balances. Like Putin still clearly has to play games with the military establishment, with the energy sector and everything like that. So it's still very much this, post-democratic revolution world. But it is, from a monarchist perspective, a country that is still in the play for a possible reemergence of monarchy, not as much as certain other smaller countries, but it's definitely, when Putin goes, no one has any idea what's going to happen. Like maybe he isn't named like an obvious successor or anything. And there's obviously there's people that want, like there's multiple claimants to the throne of like the Romanov dynasty and everything.
Wait, did you say Putin has named a successor or has not? Has not. Okay.
Yeah. Like Medvedev did the whole, like he's president for 4 years and then Putin's prime minister, but like he still had the power,
right.
And it's just one of those things that it'll be such an enormous geopolitical moment whenever Putin does, leave power, however that happens. It'll be because we don't know, like, will Russia, and the whole goal of this from the West is to, hear it from the FBI, CIA people, balkanize Russia. And that's honestly been the goal of like the Anglo-American empire since the age of like the beginning of sea empires, like, the thalassocracy versus the tellurocracy, the sea-based powers of Britain, and ultimately its kind of child America versus the land empires of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and ultimately Russia. And what happened in the course of the world wars? Germany destroyed, Austria-Hungary not an empire anymore. Russia falls to communism. It was all the Christian land empires fell.
And would elaborate, because I've never, that's a great point. You're right. It's sea empires. Was it just because I always took it as like a systematic dismantling of any, Germany was becoming more successful pre-World War One than Britain economically, militarily, everything. And I thought I took it as more a systematic destruction of the monarchies. And that was,
that's kind of a big part of it. And in many ways, Britain, while still actually being the only country of all of these that's still actually a monarchy, they had, again, neutered their monarchy so long ago to where it almost wasn't a threatening institution in and of itself. But in many ways, the reason that the tellurocracies of the land empires were the strong monarchies, or, ultimately manifested in something like, Bismarckian, German imperialism, or like, National Socialism or something like that, is that, the land empire in many ways is kind of the true fulfillment of like the Roman Empire. And that's kind of the whole question of, not just Western civilization, but like Christian civilization is who is the inheritor of the Roman Empire, right? And you can kind of understand the Roman Empire. Well, look, it was the most powerful empire in the world. Every powerful empire will probably have some sea component. There's some exceptions, but it also ultimately the Roman Empire was a land-based army conquering, and the Byzantine Empire, I believe that the Roman Empire continued in Constantinople, and then ultimately the third Rome, and this isn't like a novel take from me, would be the Russian Empire with its center in Moscow.
Right.
And in many ways, like the being based in the land, I think it does insulate you from cosmopolitanism and from a domination by people can read between the lines of like a merchant class, because that's coastal cities, right? I mean, we're Americans here. We know what that means when it comes to a political, even, religious kind of attitude. We have a few exceptions in the South and some of these places that have like, there's bays that reach out and then the people out there are conservative. But like, if you're on the coast, we know how that kind of culturally tends to lean, right? And I mean, it's even like Athens versus Sparta, right? I mean, like Athens was more, I guess, sea-based, Sparta more land-based, rigid, hierarchical military kind of dictatorship versus the supposed, obviously all those forms were much more, hierarchical than we have today. It feels silly to even criticize them, but that's kind of where the roots of that really lie. And it's, and we're seeing it today. I mean, that's the reason that like what we just saw was the big destruction of the Kerch Bridge, the bridge that connects Crimea with mainland, or attempted destruction. It's basically already fixed now. But that was funded by the Brits. At least all the evidence we have shows that was the Ukrainians using British technology, probably even British intelligence. And why would the Brits be so concerned with helping Ukraine? I mean, even the US has been like, y'all aren't probably getting Crimea back. Stop saying that. Like, it's a really silly thing to keep saying. But the reason the Russians needed to take Crimea in 2014 is because Sevastopol is their only like blue water, like big port that they could have below the permafrost. They have all the stuff up in the North Sea, up in St. Petersburg, but that freezes over. But the big Sevastopol thing, I mean, that Russia already has a more powerful military than any country. I mean, it's the second most powerful military in the world. And now if they have this powerful navy that they can keep developing, it would just be too much and England is still holding on to that old foreign policy of we're going to totally, like, we can't let this land empire also then outpace us on the sea. Like, that's just total domination. So they needed to, like, they're so committed to just not ever allowing Russia to have that. Even if it's like, it seems ridiculous at this point, it kind of proves to me how deeply rooted these kind of ideological, civilizational hatreds for each other are.
Dude, I've never heard that explanation, the sea and land empire, but that's fascinating. And I remember, I think it was the history of central bank. They talked about how that was always the history is great, and I always recommend that book to anybody. But I think that was in the book where it was talking about how you said like the blue water port that was so important to, especially Nicholas too. I mean, maybe all of them, that they wanted so badly, like a spot, I don't know whether it was I don't know where Constantinople or whatever. That was like what they kept trying to trade for, was to get access to I'm sorry.
Well, you'll really love episode 2, actually, of my premium show. We've had 12 episodes so far. In episode 2, we talk about all of the czars from Nicholas I up till Nicholas II. That's 5 czars. And part of what you're saying with Crimea and everything was basically, I mean, the Crimean Wars and so many of these wars with the Ottomans. I mean, this is a great transition, actually, is one of the main purposes of my show in the whole analysis of the Third World War is that it is leaning eventually, however irrelevant this idea may seem, because all we're focused on Russia, Ukraine, America, China, the arc of history is pushing this towards a Russo-Turkish conflict. And as in, even though Erdogan often seems like a Putin ally, I know, like, for a myriad of reasons, and I kind of bring all of these reasons together to form a cohesive picture, I believe that eventually this will lead to Russia, Turkey having a big war that will then expand. Turkey's in NATO, so I think that would then expand and become the kind of real Third World War, but that will be the nexus. It won't necessarily be, like, sure, it'll come out of something with Ukraine, but those will be the two powers that start that war. And so much of that has to do with even history from, like all of these czars. They, at a time, it was Nicholas I or Alexander II? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. During the Crimean Wars, there was a chance that the Russian Empire would have been able to take Constantinople, and that would be like a Christian city today. But every Western power decided to ally with the Turks and prevent the Russian victory and, cause, they won. It was a stalemate almost, and everyone, it just kind of returned to what it was. But it shows you that for better or for worse, the West has been turning into this golem for, pick your poison of the powers that be, to be united against Christian Rome. I mean, I guess that's kind of the history. And of course, sorry, Catholics, I don't believe that Vatican City Rome is the current successor of Rome, but in so many ways, this is key to that. And I want to grab, I'm not going to go grab it. I have this one book by Count Major General Cherep Spiridovich. He was a naval officer under Tsar Nicholas II. He was Spanish Russian. It's called The Hidden Hand. It's a very spicy book, so not going to say exactly what it says for terms of service reasons, but it goes through all these.
By not saying, you're saying. We got it.
By going through all these czars, it talks about how just throughout all of history, these, the hidden hand of banking power and financial power and everything. They prevent like holy monarchs from like, there's so many things occur that then immediately like they're assassinated or they get attempted to be assassinated. Like almost all those czars we listed were murdered, or literally all of them murdered and assassinated, up to Tsar Nicholas II, of course, ritually murdered. And I'd mentioned Igor Girkin, Igor Strelkov earlier. He is kind of agreed with us on this take as well. We don't agree with all of his analysis. He's honestly more critical of the Russian special military operation than even I am. But he, like, as far as like what's going on the ground, because he started this whole thing called the Angry Patriots Club, and he's, it's like he's being just like the liberals are persecuted in Russia for being against it. He's being persecuted for being like too patriotic, basically.
Interesting.
And I read this on my show. I can read part of it really quick. I'll just paraphrase it. He basically says the same thing, that since 2014, when he went into Donbass and led these wars, he's thought that eventually this is going to lead to a battle with Turkey. And so much is going on right now. You might have heard that the grain deal was canceled between Russia and Ukraine, and that mostly affects Turkey. Turkey was making so much money off of that grain deal, and that of course comes after Erdogan had decided to endorse Ukraine joining NATO. And so it seems that, again, Putin is playing it safe. He was trying to preserve all these relations, keep everything cozy, but as much as he might want to, the arc of history is bending, and it's moving towards Russia and Turkey are going to clash. And call that me being crazy, but I'm on the record having said that for almost a year now. And it also, if we want, we could talk a little bit about, there's a lot of kind of prophetic elements from recently reposed saints in like the Greek Orthodox Church specifically who have talked about that.
Keep going. I mean, I'm a Christian, but I'm so poor. I know, like, I'm biblically weak. but elaborate on that thought.
And for anybody who wants to learn more about Orthodox, I'm not an official apologist or I don't represent the Orthodox Church in any capacity. So ask a local priest. There should be one in your area, or there's priests online as well that you can reach out to and whatnot. But as far as some really interesting stuff goes, there's someone online who people look up, Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphou. He's a bishop in the Orthodox Church in Cyprus, and he is a spiritual child, or like what we call, someone who was discipled under multiple saints in the church, Saint Paisios, Saint Porphyrios, Saint Iakovos. And Saint Paisios had a lot of prophecies about a coming war between Russia and Turkey that would eventually lead to the liberation of Constantinople and its return to Greek people, like the Greek people. And a lot of this has to do with Cyprus. And Metropolitan Neophytos, who's still alive, who accurately prophesied about the COVID vaccine, it was a week before the lockdowns, he said, "You're entering into the last normal week of the world, prepare." And then we all know what happened, right? And he's been echoing these things and says that eventually, and Strelkov has been saying this since 2014 as well, Metropolitan Neophytos has been saying this, is the Turks will eventually, Erdogan will fall. He will be replaced by a Kemalist secularist, which almost happened in this last election. It was, he almost lost to a secular Kemalist who pro-NATO, very much more aligned with the West. He managed to squeak out the victory, but he says eventually Erdogan will fall. Eventually the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits will be closed for certain reasons, which the Turks have already been talking about that now again in the midst of all this grain deal stuff. And then he says, and I quote, like overnight, the Russians and Turks, from friends to enemies, they will go, and not a single city in Turkey won't be bombarded. That's what he says. And, that's something Greeks heard these things back in the day and got so, because, if you've ever met a Greek person, they're the most chauvinistic, nationalistic person you'll ever meet in your entire life. And they're all like, yes, it will be ours. Like I have friends who are like, we don't even need the Russians. We could beat the Turks in a military conflict right now. And I'm like, that is not true. I'm sorry. Like I love Greece. I support Greece and its conflict against historic Turks, but that is just not true.
Yeah.
And that's like, and that's part of actually why I believe some people like don't even like to talk about the prophecies. They're controversial and whatnot. And I recognize that it's not something that I foist on people if they're interested in Christianity or anything like that.
Yeah.
But the reason that I think they're true, and that because people say, oh, that's just red meat for the Greek nationalists that he was talking to. Well, if that was true, why would he have said the Russians are going to come and save them? Like, that's not something that they would want to hear. And sure, Russians and Greeks are united in their orthodoxy, but Greece is in NATO. It's much more, Western at this point and everything. And if he was just saying stuff for Greek propaganda, he would have said, we're going to rearm and we're all this stuff and we're just going to take it back ourselves. But he didn't say that. He said something that even if that he hadn't said that, and even if Strelkov hadn't said that, people have come to these conclusions based on kind of the geopolitical ideas that I had laid out before. And it's just, but I just don't think that thinking about geopolitics, thinking about worldwide conflict outside of a somewhat metaphysical context really makes sense, because like civilizations are more than just the people in them, and like it's a whole idea. And I think if you believe God is in control, like Christians do, and just reading the Bible, I mean, what do the prophecies of Daniel talk about? It talks about statues with, golden feet, silver torso, bronze body, whatever is the wooden head. And all those represent like the great empires that would come to pass and everything until then. There's so much mention of like world history. I think a lot of people think that, all that, God and history stuff ended after the Bible, but like, no, it's, we still live in, he hasn't come back yet, Jesus is still coming back. And, as, Metropolitan Neophytos talks about, like, even though prophecies, if it's a true prophecy, it will come to pass. But, the power of the prayers of the repentant believe prophecies are ultimately calls to repentance. That's kind of, these warnings, reading the Bible and reading the Old Testament. It's, repent because the flood, Noah, the basic kind of things like that. And, the power of repentance does exist in many ways, not to get too directly assigning acts of God to geopolitical events, but some could say that Erdogan even won his election because of prayers and repentance, because who knows what, like, these other people could have just, like, they could have immediately started siding more with Ukraine and the West on the whole Russia thing in a much, like, Erdogan's playing a whole game. He's a real politic person. Turkey would have immediately turned towards ideological Western secularism if he had lost this election. So I have friends in Turkey. I'm somewhat grateful that he won, although he's already betraying some of his promises. I remember that's a big deal. And I think even though, like, that's one of those things that transcends the kind of political dialectic that a lot of people were getting into. It's like, no, like, he might be the only person preventing your country from getting destroyed by Russia.
Yeah. So do you think, so I guess, I'm going to kind of like jump back here on the Romanovs and the assassination. So sorry for changing that back, but
No worries.
I remember reading that, I think again in History Essential, that they were the wealthiest family in the world, the Romanov family. And so I didn't know if you thought that was, trying to think how, like, what question I'm trying to ask, because they didn't have a central banking system in Russia, or when, do you know when Russia did get it? Because they have a central bank now, correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately the assassination of Tsar Nicholas, I mean, as this book will posit, it has a whole chapter on the Russian state bank, and it goes into how Russia was the lowest taxed nation. They produced the most goods of anybody agriculturally, and it was because they were able to lend without interest, and their state bank was a state bank that wasn't in the system that came out of the children of Meyer Amschel Rothschild, and ultimately that's like the city of London. You can still look into all of that as kind of where the whole current central banking system, and now it's the petrodollar system anchors it in the Federal Reserve. But in many ways, I know the petrodollar thing is coming home to roost, and with a lot of the Saudi Arabia stuff. But as far as the assassination of the Romanovs goes, I mean, I have my icon of the Romanov royal martyrs right here. They're considered saints and martyrs in the Orthodox Church for a myriad of reasons. They were, as I explained before, like the Roman, like, I believe that since the assassination of Tsar Nicholas II, we've kind of been living in like, the Roman Empire has been kind of decapitated a little bit. It's not dead, but it's not, literally, I believe from St. Constantine, Constantine the Great, in the 5th century up until Tsar Nicholas II, there was an effectively unbroken line, spiritually speaking, in that it was supported by the Orthodox Church from St. Constantine to Tsar Nicholas II. Like, that is 1,500 years of Christian imperium that we saw snuffed out in 1918. And I don't think it's any coincidence that in almost exactly 100 years after that, we get Trump and now the whole Third World War. Like, I think things start to get a little bit eschatological in that way. But the powers that be had such a moneyed interest in turning the largest land. I mean, if the Bolshevik Revolution, everything hadn't happened, Russia would have over 400 million people right now. Like, it'd have more people than the United States. And so this huge land empire was, this Orthodox Christian imperium was destroyed and was, given over to, the godless Bolsheviks, who were,
I like that,
the worst people of all time. And I mean, as a great priest like Father Josiah Trenum will say, brought about more Christian martyrs than any other time in history during the Soviet yoke. I mean, like, tens of thousands of priests just murdered, killed, bishops drowned in lakes. And again, like, the bank was a big part of that. And not only was, I mean, even the idea of autarky was a big part of that. Like, there was so many of these protests, like, so much, just so similar to what we see today, astroturfed protests, total media dominate. Because look, the Russian Empire, sure, it was an autarky, but like, there was a very large amount of freedom. Gun ownership was totally, like, look, some of these militias of certain groups of people that hated the Tsar were so well armed that, like, let's just say that you hear a lot about pogroms, in the Russian Empire. That's kind of the big thing you hear about how bad it was. Well, some of these anti-czarist and groups that were from around certain areas, Ukraine, down in some of these areas around southern Russia, and certain groups, like, they would get so well armed that they would be able to just threaten the local towns, and then people would get fed up with that, and it turns into all these these complicated things that then the winners of history get to rewrite as however they want. And we see how, like, the 1905 riots that I had talked about before, like, that was where Tsar Nicholas had to institute the Constitution. That's how you get, like, the Duma and, like, these like these hints of representative government came about because of an astroturfed protest like that. But as my co-host Dimitri likes to say, if we could somehow reinstitute the 1905 Constitution today, it would definitely be the most based constitution of, like, any country ever, which shows you just how traditional Russian society still was into the 20th century.
Well, dude, I don't, and I can't, again, I'm so, guys, if you have, obviously, by the amount of times I keep saying this damn book, go read History of Central Banking. But I think it was in there, and I think it was Teddy Roosevelt. It was one of our presidents.
Oh yeah, it was Taft who said that.
It was Taft, yes, who said that they had the most advanced.
He said the Emperor of Russia has passed workers' legislation, which is nearer to perfection than that of any democratic country.
Yes. And so, and
Taft was like the biggest trust buster, even though, like, Teddy Roosevelt, like, tried to run against him as, like, a more populist person. Taft busted more trusts than any president.
Yeah. Well, and so I remember that quote, which blew me away. And then even, how monarchies, they're so oppressive. Well, I don't remember which czar, but who ended serfdom, and who must have been Nicholas I or Alexander. Yeah, you're right. And he wrote to Lincoln in support of I think he even, like, gave some donation, some funding, or at least just a verbal cooperation that you guys are, we just did this. You're doing the right thing. We're in support of ending slavery. It's just fun because if you and not the general public, we can't even include them because they're beyond stupid. But anybody that's remotely, maybe they think they have an idea of going. If you brought that up, like, they couldn't comprehend that, because all of movies you just hear of tyrannical, these horrible kings or whatever. But I'm sure they would have no idea of some of these the great, amazing things that were lost after the Bolshevik Revolution.
And hey, I'm a son of Dixie, so I
nice.
I love my I've got my takes on the Civil War. But I think we were talking about it a little bit before we started recording. Was, again, people view, like, media, it's so easy to portray, like, an evil monarch. It's like, oh, look, they're rich and they are out of touch and they have all these luxuries that make them silly. And, like, wasn't it just great to have a heckin' democracy? It makes so much more sense. But, like, look, if you think about, like, what's, like, even normies, even liberals think from, like, this perspective, our biggest problem today is corruption. The elites are out of this populism talk has almost become meaningless. It's talked about so much, but, like, no one's trying to address the problem. And the problem fundamentally is democracy. And this is spoken about by even someone like Aristotle. Like a democracy, like fundamentally, I mean, what is it? You have monarchy is like the ideal version. You have the disrupted version is tyranny. You have aristocracy, the corrupt version is oligarchy. You have polity, the corrupt version is democracy, right? And democracy is like fundamentally like you decentralize the power so much to where you basically the power can then be accumulated by the money power, basically. Like enough people can be bought off to where the game of representation can still be played. I mean, think about how BlackRock owns like 16% or 10% or 9%, and then State Street owns another 7%. Like they just get that. Look, obviously it would be suspicious if BlackRock just wholly owned as a subsidiary every company. That would be strange, but they are able to have a controlling interest to always sway the ship in the way that they want to go. And that's the exact same principle with democracy. And sure, in a monarchy, you can get stuck with a bad monarch. But let's be honest. Human history shows that if a monarch gets bad enough, the people will do something about it. I mean, throughout the Byzantine Empire, I mean, you can almost call it the people's veto in some way. And that's not to say that revolution is good. I'm fundamentally anti-revolutionary. But I believe like there's so many examples, especially in Orthodox history, of the church standing up to corrupt monarchs as well. Like, I mean, people know the famous example. Who was it? Was it St. Ambrose turning away? Was it I can't believe I'm forgetting which emperor it was. I think it was like one of the sons of Constantine or somebody turning him away at the church for having just committed, a massacre against civilians. He was like, you need to go and repent and, before you can just come into church and take communion. And that's kind of the system of government that I believe was, from Constantine to Tsar Nicholas, the real symphonia, the emperor and the church kind of ruling the church holds the emperor accountable and the emperor protects the church. And that's like in the Orthodox and Catholic traditions, the ecumenical councils. The phrase ecumenical council means like called by the emperor. People always say like, oh, Christianity got corrupted by Constantine, blah, 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 doing all this stuff. But no, like the empire was what preserved doctrine, what, Arianism, Nestorianism, these heresies that, disputed the nature of Jesus Christ were, ultimately the empire was able to had the funds to gather all the bishops together to discuss these problems and come to those conclusions. And that's like such an important, I think, epistemic root that like a government should have, like a monarchy should. And even like the founding fathers, a lot of them supported the idea of like a state church, and like the ones that had a much more decentralized, state vision of America. They wanted states to have state churches and states to be able to have these kind of connections with the cultural aspects of the people that, like, Maryland was a much more Catholic place, Massachusetts, some of these places much more Puritan influences. You get all these. Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't even a Christian by my estimations, he supported, the idea of a state church just because he understood the importance of even just first principles and presuppositions, if nothing else. And ultimately now this democracy has kind of become that first principle, right? Like now we defend this isn't what we talk about. We defend democracy worldwide, all this kind of stuff. It's like, it's Keith Woods has a great video on this, the development of the modern worldview, just like Karl Popper, just the kind of paradox of tolerance crap about how like it's true. Fundamentally, like anti-racism and post-World War II is like the religion of today, right? Like never again is the phrase, right? Like we have this thing we know is bad, which is fascism / the authoritarian personality, which is ultimately just anything true, good, and beautiful, versus, what we know as the open society, free and everything like that. And I think Keith Woods does a good job of pointing out that like ultimately that conflict is rooted in like nominalism versus essentialism. Like, do you believe in objective truth or not? Like, that's it. Like, and like, that's why you hear like people, that's a big thing I don't like about conservatives is sometimes they see something that's like so antithetical to their worldview that they hand wave it away as stupid when it's actually very well thought out. Like people say things like why Plato was a fascist, and people are like, you idiot, fascism was a late 19th century, blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, you don't get it. They are making like a fundamental philosophical point that Plato, theory of the forms, he was an essentialist. Like he posited that there was, objective standards that you can hold reality to, that you can understand. To somebody who believes the modern worldview, that is fascism. Like that is like, you would then assert meaning onto somebody that finds different meaning in something, that you've basically just committed the Holocaust. Like that's kind of what that's I'm sorry, but that is that seems like a ridiculous point, but that's where the modern worldview gets you.
Yeah, dude. And this might be torn away. So again, like I told you, I'm like I'm a Christian, and I'm about to have a baby in November. We're like deciding where
Congrats,
we
man.
my wife is was raised Catholic, but anyway, um, what is your, so I've gotten it, and I'm not equipped enough to do this debate, and so a lot of my like people that I, in our circle, that are Christians, usually like what not they're they're not orthodox, they're non-denominational
Yeah.
or something kind of like that. They'll argue that monarchism is not good either, because biblically, and again, like I'm ill-equipped to even describe what points they point out. um I forget the story, like they wanted the king, God gave him a king, and it didn't work out or
Yeah.
something.
There's I went to a college that was pretty Protestant, and this is kind of a very common exegesis you hear from the Old Testament about how actually Saul fulfills all the prophecies of a good king, even though he was a bad king. And David, with all of his mistakes, he was, the king after God's own heart. So it shows you that these kind of requirements for monarchism aren't like, exact. The problem with that one is that that's not a cohesive worldview to have. Ultimately, you're still going to have a government, right? Like people are going to come, if
Right.
everyone
Great
in
point.
society converts to
Great point.
Christianity, you still have to run the society.
Yeah.
And I think in many ways, I love the quote of St. John of Kronstadt, heaven is a kingdom, hell is a democracy.
Yes.
And you can make, I mean, even John Milton, who I don't even know if he was a monarchist exactly. He also wasn't
He flipped.
he
Are
wasn't
we
even a
British?
he wasn't even a little O Orthodox
The
Christian.
British guy, John Milton?
Yeah, broke
Yeah,
Paradise
yeah.
Law.
He flipped back and forth. Because of
Yeah.
my book I'm reading. But anyway,
Mhm.
continue. Yeah.
But I mean, it basically presents like when Satan goes down with all the demons, like all the demons are like they're trying to have their voices heard. Like Satan kind of convinced, he becomes kind of like the people's champion, like of the
Hmm.
demons in a way. And like
Yeah.
it's this kind of revolution. And look, I mean, you hear communist, even though like, classical liberals and modern conservatives are like, oh, you communists are anti-democratic as well. But like they just view they view their perspective as democracy taken to its logical conclusion, which is like total class warfare and everything. Like you hear communists talk all the time. I mean, Democrat, like, all the names are like the Democratic People's Republic, whatever. They all like that
Right.
kind of stuff because
That's a
they,
good point.
they have a metaphysics to their democracy. Like people, look, I'm not a Marxist. Me and Dimitri have debated Haas and like the right wing Marxists and people before, but like, Marxism is like it is fundamentally a religion in like a totalizing metaphysical sense. And people that come at you just like, I'm just going to argue against this with classical liberal talking points. It's like, you're going to get eaten alive every time, man. Like that's not a cohesive perspective. Tabula rasa, like, just the kind of
Yeah.
rank secularism, like you're going to lose to someone who's taking that to its logical conclusion of, proletarian Marxist Leninism.
Right. Well, so, and then just continue, like, it's like, I tried to have this debate, but so is in the Bible though, does it specify one way or the other, whether like, or it doesn't really give
No,
you an
no, there's
answer?
no. I mean, there's no exact pronouncement on how to run the government in the Bible per se.
Okay.
But I
Okay.
think I mean, if you want to have my co-host would be even better at arguing for monarchism because he speaks
Oh, dude, then
Russian and
I
has
gotta
all
get
has
you
read.
guy. I got a debate for you guys, but keep going.
Yeah. He's writing some stuff about that too. But again, as far as like from like a Christian perspective, again, I think again the reason this is such an easy thing for Protestants is because I think, especially after kind of the mainline denominations, Anglicanism, Episcopalianism, the more liturgical traditions of Protestantism totally fell to, Rockefeller influence and everything. The church history is just totally lost. And you kind of
Oh
have
yeah.
everyone just kind of accidentally, just by not knowing anything else, adopted a sort of Baptist trail of blood perspective of history that's like
Ooh, I like that.
Constantine, and the Catholic Church killed all the true Christians and enacted paganism, which totally ignores that like the Orthodox Church even exists and like all sorts of,
Mm,
other things. It just assumes that there was never a great schism or anything like that. But when you understand like the canon of scripture and so much of our understand things like the Nicene Creed and so much important,
mm,
like these came about at the ecumenical councils, which the councils are pronounced in the scriptures. There's the Council of Acts and, in Jerusalem between where Peter and Paul have their dispute and everything. And it becomes very clear that, these councils are where things are decided. And ultimately Constantine becomes a Christian, becomes the emperor. Supposedly we believe in this sign conquer, a cross appeared in the sky and everything. It kind of, the question becomes, well, what do we do with this? Are we going to have a revolution and establish a republic now in Constantinople, like, or in like Rome, and like it just, sure, we had like the history of the republic in the past, but like, even if you had some kind of, I know Calvinists and Presbyterians that like to use the Netherlands in like the 1600s as an example, like this kind of semi-democratic, it's like, I can't remember his name. It's like Kuyperian, kind of, these ideas of sphere sovereignty. I'm forgetting the exact, sorry, my old boss is going to hear this, who's a Calvinist up in Northern Idaho, and be like, how did you forget all this?
That's
but
hilarious.
It's not a monarchist system, but like even all these systems, like there's very much a hierarchy in many ways, like a kind of, there's nothing Christian about this kind of ultra liberation based dissolution of hierarchy, because we're kind of like all this transgender stuff. So many people are finally catching up on this and being like, oh, they're destroying all the boundaries. It's like, well, you had your torch and pitchfork in the crowd like everybody else when they were abolishing church state connections, something like the monarchy. I mean, look, I'll just say, in America, the Civil Rights Revolution led to the destruction of so many institutions that held America together, and all of those hierarchies. Look, you may not have liked the hierarchy that was being enforced. That's a debate for a different day, but you can't deny that it was deconstructed. And so now that we're getting to deconstructing things like gender and marriage, people want to stop the train. It's like, it's too late, man. Cool. It's way too late.
Dude, that's beautiful. My brain, some people are sort, you're one of those guys, sort. That's such a great way to understand. You're right. Like, you started that train. It's already full speed ahead, dude. It's busted through any road. Like, good luck. You're going to need Spider-Man and all those webs to stop.
Well, think about it, right? I mean, but if you think about it that way, I mean, we still supposedly have a king in England, but if you think about it, up until the World Wars, we were run by this ancien regime, these, corrupt nobles or these corrupt military leaders. Why shouldn't we give like total, like we supposedly haven't had a chance to give like total dissolution of hierarchy a chance, right? Like if you're against all of that stuff, like how can you be against like this new, supposedly, like, hasn't been tried. These people were all oppressed under that old system that you agree with me is bad. It's like, again, I'm not saying that because your enemy is against something, you then support the system. There's a positive case for it too, as I think can be made in a book like this that explains how the monarch, look, this is a principle that I don't think I actually said live, is that, look, the monarch is rich because the land and that nation, and in theory, the idea is that God endowed him with this higher place in society. The monarch is never going to want, he's never going to be in need of funds. In theory, he's unbribable. And of course, politics is always going to be involved. There's puppet monarchs. But in theory, in this hereditary monarchy, the person in charge should have a motivation to raise their child to then be the best. There should, like, the place of interference, like with any kind of elected official, is so much different. And this idea that it is fundamentally more difficult for a money power to take, like, I mean, like even someone like Gaddafi, like they hated him because he was doing the same kind of stuff. Like he took power, he was using the state. And look, you can debate the economics of what he was doing, but at a fundamental level, he was exercising executive power out of his own power base. And that is what the system can't have. And that's why, like, I mean, something like Baathism. I mean, that's why Baathism had to be taken out through the Arab Spring, and like Saddam Hussein was, one of the Baathists in Iraq, is because it was this, well, mostly besides they were all aligned against Israel, but it was this kind, it also allowed for this kind of strongman, semi-socialist interaction with the public that allowed the public and the strongman to have a better relation without that media elite kind of mediation between them that always has the ruler at the beck and call of the media and elite, and then the people at the beck and call of the media elite to then sometimes, the color revolution playbook to then rise up against the ruler at the behest of, Western backers. And the idea of a true, I mean, look, and we know this, that book that I talked about enlists those 5 monarchs who, many of them, like someone like Nicholas the First, for example, is really considered, like a saint, someone like he's not like Tsar Nicholas has been, the second has been canonized, but there's others that, Tsar Paul, that's what I meant, not Nicholas. Tsar Paul the First is someone who is considered a very holy person. And like all of those rulers were just they all knew Like by the time he got to Tsar Nicholas, I mean, there's like recordings of his families, like they're talking, they know all about how the Anglo Empire wants to kill all of them, how like because it's been like dozens of generations of their ancestors had to fight against were fighting against this system, and
Right.
they just knew, like they knew who was coming after. I mean, look, like I'm never mind. I'm not even going to say that live, but I'll tell you after we stop recording. But
Okay.
like the Rome. I mean, look. I mean, World War II. I mean, people talk about this all the time. The destruction of the German and the Austro-Hungarian empires, and they had, they had, look. Say what you will, but Hitler, he took power. He was operating an independent base of power, and even people, of course, have accusations that he was funded by industrialists and everything like that. But
Yes.
that's even regardless of what you think of that, it's so similar. We build up some proxy to fight somebody else. They get taken down. The proxy that we built up still maintains their ideological independent priors and uses the power that we gave them to execute their will. And now we've created, at least in our minds, a monster. And we have to but then in many ways there was the whole time there was someone else playing our guys to then lead us into another war. Like it's this whole thing. It's like, oh, see, I'm sure there's some idiot contractors that really think that we're just funding, the Mujahideen, all these groups to really just win the fight, as if it's like, oh, it wasn't a bigger plan to pump that region with weapons and have us go in there for war. Like it's every angle is played in all of this. And I remember being in an economics class in college and my professor is pointing out like how the power of worldwide fractional reserve banking grew with these world wars and how so much money was made with the weapons finances and everything. And I just raised my hand and I was like, professor, this is all very interesting and everything, but like, am I going over the line by saying, like, I think we all see the motivation. Maybe the bankers are behind the wars. And he was like,
What did
I
he
see how you can
say?
say that, but we just don't have any evidence. And I'm like,
Oh
okay,
my
maybe we'll talk about
God.
this after class. But like, he was a
Yeah.
libertarian. He's a good guy. I'm not even trying to
Oh,
crap on my
okay.
professor, but he was just like a fundamentally libertarian-minded guy and everything, really just into Austrian economics. But he was even criticizing the banks in the graph, but he just wasn't willing to, in front of the whole class, I guess, go conspiracy mode. But it was like
Yeah.
sure, monarchies did fight wars against each other, but it was for different motivations than this.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, I totally agree, dude. Well, and didn't I mean, just so many of these wars, and I know I don't know if that was before the show. We were talking William of Orange, how he was funded by bankers to overthrow James II, and the moment and James, it was his daughter's husband. She had no idea this guy was going to overthrow. He said, should I get ready? And everyone's like, no, he's just coming with like a few 10,000 buddies. Don't worry about it. And the moment he loses power, William Orange passes through the Tonnage Act, and it just reminded me so much of our Federal Reserve Act. I think like 1/5 of Parliament was already ever, because they were farming or whatever. Of like that, only 20% could even read the Tonnage Act. And this was supposed to just be an extra tax on ships to help fund whatever war was upcoming with France. I don't know who it was with, but it just reminded me, so all these, it makes you wonder, even like the protests of the 16, 17, 1800s were all to overthrow their governments or to cause distress with their monarchy, was again funded by just banking elites to remove the last blockage for debt slavery that they're going to put this country through.
And this stuff goes, you go up into the First and Second World Wars. I mean, half of these people in the UK government and everything, like Winston Churchill, I mean, they're like the descendants of the people that did it all back then in the 1600s. It's like, and like, that's the thing, like England, it became like the worst of both worlds, where like their monarchy was totally neutered, but they still have all these like weird lords and hereditary stuff that can like, that's involved in the city of London and these weird hereditary bloodline stuff. It just became this, I mean, like I said before, London is like the true like thalassocratic cosmopolitan just city that just became like this banking empire. And now, of course, I mean, now everyone's saying London's not a British city anymore. It's like, I mean, sure, it's come home to roost, but it's just, technically you already know this, Jack, I'm sure the second highest ranking person in England is the mayor of the city of London, not Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London that, everyone thinks about. The mayor of the city of London is technically like basically equal with the Queen of England as far as actual power goes, and that's because of all this all the bank influence. So,
dude, I think I just saw like London is, I think, I don't want to say maybe the first, but it's fully foreigners outnumber
Mm-hmm.
native. I mean, that's like, and that's like something I always just like tell people, but like, it anything, like any rational person, would you say, is this good? Is this a positive thing that we're doing? And that's how you know that these countries are so compromised or so corrupted, because there has not been a single decision that has went in the people's way in the last 200 years, even probably longer than that.
Well, and the silly, like, no, like this, the cognitive dissonance that everyone pretends to not know the connection between like moneyed power and mass migration. Like, come on, like, don't, we're not like, I know you're not that stupid. Like, consume like low level consumers as opposed to wealth building. Like, it's like just a basic scam. Like, I don't understand how people like act like, no, actually, like it'll help everybody if we import a whole new underclass of people that will lower everybody's. It's just, it's you start to like, once you know this, once you take the red pill, you're like, man, I spent hours of my youth engaging in political debates that was just a false dialectic the whole time about like, do we, I mean, I'm still grateful for Trump for reinvigorating the immigration conversation, because I remember it was just like touching legal immigration was just not a thing, and now people are open to these kinds of conversations that I think that conversation can lead you into this conversation that we're having now about the
Yeah.
nature of civilizations.
Yeah, dude. Well, so, and now I know I keep kind of like jumping around. Um, like what's the best scenario for Russia here? Okay, wait, two questions here. Do you think Russia is fighting like with one arm behind its back? And then, yeah, we'll start with that question.
Yeah. I definitely think so, and I think even a lot of honest people in the West have like started to realize this. I can't remember who it was. It was someone on like CNN recently, basically said like, it was some colonel or something, was like, yeah, we knew this summer counteroffensive was never going to work because we didn't give them planes, and the Russians have amazing air power and everything. And it's like, yeah, the Russians, I mean, Putin, they only did partial mobilization. Putin has still only been striking, like he's only struck a few even like decision-making centers of people. He's really, really trying. Fundamentally, he's trying so hard, and I'm not just saying this to shill for Putin. He is fundamentally trying to reduce as many civilian casualties as possible, because he knows at the end of the day, he's going to have to occupy at least a little bit of territory that used to be under Ukraine. And you can't give them too many opportunities to propagandize those people, because the U.S. runs the most powerful propaganda intelligence operation in the world. So for better or for worse, you have to play this nice guy game with the narrative. I think Putin sometimes takes it a little bit too far, because people think of Putin as this former KGB agent that killed people. Putin was a desk jockey. He was a lawyer, desk jockey, who
I didn't know
is a careful game player, that at the beginning of his career, people thought he was going to play ball with the West. It was only in like 2008 and then into like 2011, 2012 that he took what many people call his national. Read this great article by Anatoly Karlin, Putin's Nationalist Turn, or Russia's Nationalist Turn. It kind of talks about the rise of Putin as an actual nationalist figure, as opposed to being a more just realpolitik person willing to work with both sides. But as far as it fighting with one hand behind its back, I mean, that's part of what, Strelkov, the guy who got arrested, people, even we would say Prigozhin, who did the whole coup, even would have been touching on some of these things. It's like, look, we have the ability to do a lot more here, but it's, Putin still wants some kind of peace treaty on his terms. That's like, you're going to have to enforce that. As Jim Jatras, geopolitical commentator, former U.S. diplomat, said on my show, you have to enforce that reality on the ground. These people have, like, it's been too long of all of this. And again, if they're still talking about retaking Crimea, I think you need to, and I think that's what we've seen super recently, and things have really started heating up again. We're seeing these huge strikes on Odessa. We saw a strike today 200 meters from the Romanian border at the port in Rainy, like super close to NATO countries. And that's in the aftermath of the Kerch Bridge bombing and the end of the grain deal. And people are thinking finally, and we've been predicting this on the show for a while, that they will push to Odessa to take all of the Black Sea coast from Ukraine. And I think that could be coming. There's room. I mean, there's pushes in like the Luhansk, Kharkov region that supposedly like hundreds of thousands of troops are being gathered in Belgorod. And then of course this is the thing that you probably know about this a bit, Jack. Like, I record a show and then like I talk about things, and then right as I stop recording, big news happens, and like something I just said like is almost irrelevant. And thankfully it didn't happen exactly, but right after, we released our latest episode, today and yesterday, Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, meets with Putin and is talking about Wagner's in my country and they're pressuring me to invade Poland. We can't allow, like, Poland wants to take parts of Western Ukraine and we can't allow that.
I think Putin, I just saw that. Yeah.
Which makes no sense to me because Putin in earlier speeches has said that we have no hope of ever taking West Ukraine. It's like basically Polish. So like just super interesting kind of like, he's definitely doing some trolling. And it's like, but it's becoming very clear that there are like someone who identifies more like on the Russian nationalist side of this conflict. Finally, preparations for this push that we thought would have come a few months ago. And it's this Ukrainian counteroffensive, like I said, has totally failed.
Oh, dude.
And I do, like, again, I'm not going to make any prediction for when exactly, but some have speculated that there's going to be something big before September 18th, because that's when, so they arrested that Strelkov guy. He's being held in pretrial detention until then. Like, they're basically just keeping him in jail for like 2 months for literally like an incitement level, like hate speech thing, like saying, like incitement against the army or whatever, which I get it. It's a wartime economy. I'm not a libertarian. I believe in, arresting people, but he was a patriot. He's not some, he's not someone like saying we need to, Putin must go, we need to liberalize,
he's not calling him Putler.
Yeah, no, he was, he wishes he was Putler. Just kidding. But it's like people are saying maybe something big is going to happen in those 2 months, and they want to, because he has one of the biggest Telegram channels in like the Russian commentariat space. They're like, maybe we don't want him to, comment on some of the things that are going to go on, whether that's a big push or worst case scenario, a really terrible peace treaty. But I think thankfully the chances of that are diminishing, because that
of a peace treaty.
Yeah, right now a peace treaty would likely be the worst for, I just think, the Russian and Christian people on the ground in these situations. Like it would just this thing would just go on, and then in 5 more years, Russia would have to invade again.
Do you see this turning in? And I know we're getting close. We'll like wrap, but do you see this turning into? It feels like it's turning into a forever war, But
that's my fear, is that there are elites in Russia that want to do that. That the West wants to do that objectively because they just can't have Russia win. And Putin is caught in the middle between the people with money and possibly even people in the Ministry of Defense telling him to do that. Again, I have no direct insight into behind the scenes in Russia. I have friends in Russia. I talk to people. Dmitry speaks Russian, probably even knows more than me. But there's a good chance that, if you want to view Putin as, if you want to have any kind of charity towards Putin, that, he's kind of balancing these people. He's balancing his nationalist patriotic support from the Christian people of Russia with an unfortunate desire of his elite that are wanting to, as much as they can, still profit from this. Like, at least the ones that have stayed, a lot of them have fled Russia, like Anatoly Chubais, the father of the Sputnik vaccine in Russia, known, dual Israeli-Russian citizen, has in the UK and everything, one of the oligarchs that looted Russia in the 90s. He finally left beginning of 2022 because he was against the special military operation, obviously. But there are people of his persuasion that have, been a little bit more supportive of it, I think, for their own, industrialized purposes. But ultimately, I guess, if you want to hear my actual full take personally, I believe that regardless of all of that corruption, let's be honest, I guarantee you, if you were a Jew living under King David in the kingdom, I could come up with a million conspiracy theories about King David, how he's compromised, remember with Bathsheba, he did all this stuff. But at the end of the day, God is in control. And just as God used empires like the Assyrians and the Persians, evil kings like Nebuchadnezzar, who even came to the faith, non-Jewish/Christian kings like Cyrus, to bring about his will in the world, so too can God use a perhaps somewhat corrupt Russian civilization to, even if it's something as simple as punishing the West for its degeneracy, something like that. I mean, that's how people don't like hearing that anymore because we've been secularized for 300 plus years. But look, throughout most of human history, people were interested in sigils, prophecies, prayers, things like that. I find that epistemology, frankly, just more whimsical, interesting, and a way to look at the world than the rote secularism and materialism that most people analyze things with today. But I do believe that as an Orthodox Christian, I do put weight in the prophecies of the saints, and that combined with my civilizational outlook, I believe that ultimately, like I said, this will push to a Russo-Turkish conflict, and I believe out of that will come a czar in Russia, and I do believe that, yeah. Like
I
they're
better study up my Russian then, dude. They're my South African with that like gated community.
Oh yeah.
Last question, literally. And so I don't. Some two people in the chat wanted me to ask you this. Do you have? And I don't even know what this means. So, do you have a take on the whole Osiris Twitter X thing? Do you know what that means?
I don't even know what that is. So I'm
Okay,
sorry. Is it just the name of Twitter, like the X name? Like, I've seen people getting conspiratorial about. I follow some of the like more schizo conspiracy accounts, and some of them are just leaving Twitter now because of X. I mean, look, I follow all of the like Trump, Elon Musk, Antichrist stuff. I don't ascribe to it, but like I keep up with it. Like I'm sure people here follow Donnie Darkin on Twitter.
Yes,
I don't. I do not agree with him. I think he has I think his worldview has a lot of metaphysical problems, but I think he's a good researcher, and I think he documents a lot of good information. And I mean, even someone like, you can even kind of take what he researches and combine it with someone like Charles Johnson, who's basically just a materialist secularist. You know Charles Johnson? You probably follow him on Twitter.
Yeah.
He has his whole theories about how the whole, like, he's still like pro Anglo-American establishment, but from like a counter-Semitic perspective. From like he's like he is against like Likud, Netanyahu, like the kind of Israeli establishment and government. He is like, he thinks that they use Russian and Chinese proxies to influence like the true American ethnos and stuff. Like I kind of keep up with every perspective so I can weigh everything. But yeah, I don't know about the Osiris X stuff. It sounds like deep lore though. I'll have to look into it.
Yes, definitely deep lore. But well, dude, this and any books that you please send them over, dude, because I'd love to learn.
Yeah.
You know, you got awesome. So this was so great, dude. But all the people are saying how impressive you were. So where can they listen to you, Conrad, follow you, all those good things?
Yeah, worldwarnow.substack.com is kind of our home base. We have our main weekly show there, free to the public, as well as our mostly weekly premium show. When you subscribe for $7 a month on the Substack, it's there. Also, all of our articles. We have a YouTube channel, World War Now. We have a Twitter, World War Now _. Here's our logo and everything. You want to see how it looks.
Yeah.
World War Now _ on Telegram, World War Now Telly. I'm on Twitter, Gnomrad. My co-host is on Twitter at OCanonist. He's got like 42,000 followers, so he's got.
I didn't know that was your I don't know why I didn't know that. Now this makes sense. I follow him. Dude, he's got. I didn't know. I don't know why I didn't know that. But sorry.
Yeah, he's great, and he speaks Russian, so he can again. The Russian language is so deep, and there's so much going on in that civilization that compared to other languages in Western Europe have not been translated into English. So gives a lot of good insight as well. So check him out. Yeah. But thank you so much, Jack. This has been great. And maybe I'll have you on my premium show to talk about some conspiracy stuff sometime.
Hey, anytime, dude. This was awesome. So I'll put all your show, links and stuff. And thanks for doing this, dude.
Thank you so much.
All right, guys. Thanks for listening. I'm going on a short vacation, but I think I'm doing a show Friday or Saturday. So I'll see you guys then. Take care. All right, dude.